So today's agenda, I won't linger too much on who we are and what we've been doing, but today we're going to be touching on the security elements of G Suite. I wanted to make sure that you're all going to have some tips and tricks to take away with you. And I know that security is a very broad subject, so we're going to cover up as much as we can in the time that we've got. Essentially just helping you keep your data secure whilst you're all working remotely and in a cloud environment. As we're all aware, sort of BAU has definitely changed significantly over the past few weeks. But in terms of security and data protection, not much has changed in terms of compliance standards, best practices, and day-to-day admin controls, etc. I'd say the major change has been that IT teams are now managing a far larger remote workforce than ever before, or ever that they've witnessed in previous firms. So we're wanting to give you some information around the security features that are available to you with G Suite. So we'll touch on the end user to begin with. So looking at two-factor verification, app access control, and things like that. We'll move on to endpoint security, so managing the device with MDM and Chrome browser and things like that. And then we'll jump on to G Suite security features. So looking at data loss prevention, DLP, context-aware access, and then we'll jump into some Q&A at the end. So that's pretty much it from me. I'll pass over to Jacob to begin the webinar.
Thanks for the comprehensive introduction there, Alex. COVID-19, as I'm sure we've experienced, has brought the world to a standstill. You may have noticed the usage of the word unprecedented can only be described as unprecedented. But in this section, we'll be focusing on the folks that are lucky enough to be able to work remotely in amongst all of the madness that we see. And for some of those folks, it's uncharted territory. Perhaps until now, some of your organizations have refused to allow working from home. But for the other organizations, we're seeing their SaaS-first, cloud-based IT strategy pushed to its limits. So this brings us into today's session. How can we govern G Suite data remotely? How do we prevent unauthorized access? And over the next hour, 45 minutes, I'll be focusing on the tools available to G Suite admins to keep your data secure. So where better place to start than with the end users that have now found their working conditions completely different. Some folks have made a spare room an office out of their spare room or out of their kids' rooms. And I think they're definitely the user base we want to be focusing on first. And I wanted to provide some context via Google's transparency report before we talk about the product and what's available in G Suite. And I could have chosen about 1,000 different graphs, but the one that I've chosen to stick with just shows detection of dangerous sites. And it goes back all the way to 2006. What we can see is phishing sites are becoming more and more common over time, whereas malware sites are becoming a less popular, a less common vector of attack. And more information about all these graphs and what it actually means in reality can be found on the link that I've put on the screen. But this is really why we're starting with end users today. They're the ones on the front line. They're at risk, and typically they're the most common vector of attack for someone that's wanting to get unauthorized access to your environment. So where do we start? I'm going to start with the basics, and I appreciate for many of the folks on this call, this may be the absolute core basics. And the easiest way to protect your organization from that unauthorized access is to simply enable and enforce 2SV. 2SV, for the uninitiated, provides a way for users to provide a secondary authentication method beyond the password when they log in. So if the password does get compromised, access is only granted if the secondary method is also provided, whether it's an SMS code, a code via phone, or a security key. We can create these very wonderfully strong, complex password policies, but what we can't do as administrators, we can't prevent a user from just using the same password for your corporate G Suite that they've used elsewhere that may have been compromised in the past. And again, I appreciate we're starting off with the core basics here, but even as a G Suite partner, we see organizations that simply haven't enabled 2SV to start off with, let alone enforced it. So please, if there is one thing, and only one thing you take from this webinar, please let that be, if you don't have 2SV enabled and enforced, you must absolutely do so to protect your users. And I wanted to briefly just look at the admin config for 2SV. Sometimes when we talk about 2SV, it can be quite daunting when we're saying turn it on for the entire organization. In terms of the actual tech side, how we do it, if we navigate to the admin console and we go to security, under basic settings, you have this checkbox that allows users to turn 2SV in the first place. And then if you hit the advanced settings, you'll get a enforced 2SV box as well. So once we've allowed 2SV, we want to enforce it. So users have to configure it for their account. We can set an enforcement date, so we have time to communicate this big change out to users before we see the tech change take its place. And we can also set an enrollment period. So a new user to the business can have a time period for them to configure 2SV after their first login. And we remove the need to generate and then unsecurely share out backup codes for every new user that starts the business if we set this enrollment period. We can set it to a day, a week, 4 weeks. We typically say a week, but if you want to be more secure, definitely go for a day and make it part of the onboarding process. And finally, we can set 2SV methods. We can say that specific OUs can only allow security keys, which is great for your admins and great for your VIP users if you want to have a more secure 2SV methodology. With 2SV covered, I want to have a brief interlude to cover OAuth. So to facilitate app access, modern and more secure apps use OAuth, and this allows users to give access to specific G Suite scopes, to allow for integration with third parties without giving complete control via forfeiting a username and password over to an unknown party. But the question is, how are you protecting your users from blindly allowing access to any third-party app? If a user allows a third party, what checks and balances are in place for your organization to prevent that third party from reading, making a copy of, or indeed deleting all that user's data? In the image on the right, this app, which is mischievously titled Malicious Script, would be allowed to see, edit, create, and delete all of my spreadsheets in Drive. And it would also, if I clicked the big blue Allow button, it would also be allowed to connect to an external service, but I don't have any more information. So if I kind of pose a question to the folks on the call, if I'm one of your users, what are you putting in place to stop me from hitting that big blue Allow button and forfeiting access to all my data to some random unknown third party? And I hope for a lot of organizations, the answer would be, oh, hey, we'll just configure app access control in the G Suite environment. For those that aren't familiar with what app access control is, app access control simply governs access to the G Suite service scopes via OAuth. And as mentioned, a lot more of these secure apps are using OAuth rather than requiring the username and password. So they are very, very common to see in a standard user environment. And app access control allows us to restrict access to the scopes for things like Gmail and Drive. We can also then trust applications. So if we trust an organization and what they're producing, we can give them access to these restricted scopes. And we can also trust all domain-owned apps. So we can reduce the impact to any internally developed applications or tools. And I would definitely think your developers would appreciate not hindering all of their development processes by allowing that. And I'm sure that sounds great. So what I want to do in here is talk about not just, cool, here's a product and it's available to you, but talk about how we would actually think about rolling it out and the implications it would have for your environment. So first off, I think it's really important that you communicate what this is to the business and tell them what's coming and to pick an appropriate time. Many people are working from home right now, and an app use case might not be obvious to an IT team where you can't ask the question directly. But revoking app access, if it does have a legitimate use case, can cause quite a lot of headaches. So definitely talk to your users, tell them what's happening, and plan this really far in advance. With that being said, if you do navigate to the admin console and hit security and then app access control, the first thing we should do in this image, it should be visible on the call. In the image, you trust every application in the environment. This might seem a bit counterintuitive considering we're talking about security, but stage one is about stopping things from getting worse. When we trust all applications, it means that new applications that users start to use won't be trusted, and we can essentially control the spread of applications while we go through this process. Once we've trusted every application, we then want to go through and restrict the scopes, restrict every scope in G Suite. So only the apps that we've trusted can then access the API scopes. And this is the point at which you'll see any user impact. So new applications, like I mentioned, are not trusted by default and can't access any API scopes. So what we've done after step 2 is done, we've limited app access to just the stuff that we've trusted on step 1. Step 3 is about providing a form and doing an error message to tell users to give something that's more human when they try and access a scope that is otherwise restricted. So the way that we see it best is we create a very simple Google form and we say to a user, what's your use case? What's the application name, how many users, and we provide that form to a user when they hit the error message. And then step 4 is probably the most daunting and scariest part, in that we've trusted loads of applications in step 1, and you'll have trusted all sorts of weird and wonderful things, I can guarantee it. But what we need to do now in step 4 is to reduce that access to applications that don't have the business use case. I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful applications in my time. Common ones are things like Dropbox. Actually, do we have a business use case for Dropbox, or can we rescind its drive access so it isn't pulling our files and storing them somewhere? And then step 5 is to maintain this trusted apps list. It's to make sure the apps you trust today are reviewed in 12 months' time. Trust is always a sensitive subject, and we shouldn't ever be granting trust on an indefinite basis, especially when we're considering data security. Going through this process will lock down your API scopes, but it'll also reveal a lot about where your data sits. We often see shadow IT systems being used en masse, but just not visible to IT teams. And this process not only improves your security, but gives visibility. We can often use this information to take back control of our data, and also just to have a visibility on how it's being used. App access control, like I mentioned, it is quite a comprehensive process to go through, but it is absolutely worth going through for the sake of data security. The Advanced Protection Program is kind of a combination of 2SV and OAuth. When we push out 2SV config and OAuth config, it can take a while to implement across a large organization. And for users that have a more pressing need for security, they can enroll themselves in the Advanced Protection Program. And that means that users are enforced to have 2 security keys, which prevents the SMS or telephone codes, and the second key simply acts as a backup. And the security keys, Google says that they have never had a security key phished. It's not possible because it's a physical key. So you first of all have this more secure method of doing 2SV in the first place. The second item is reducing app access. So for users that are on the Advanced Protection Program, regardless of app access control, we can do that at a different time. If a user's on the Advanced Protection Program, we can only allow Google Core apps and specific third-party apps to access the emails and drive files of the particular user on the Advanced Protection Program. And the final thing was extra steps around the recovery process. We can minimize the risk of impersonation that people might be trying to do to get access to that account, and we can make the recovery process a bit more of a nightmare for those people that are trying to get access that are unauthorized. I guess anecdotally, we've seen C-suite employees of organizations with 10,000 users plus roll this out with minimal impact to their day-to-day life, but they have this massive peace of mind benefit for both them and their organization. It's definitely something we would recommend users enroll themselves in if they have high visibility in the industry or in the press, as those are often targeted in these coordinated phishing attacks. And finally, when we're thinking about end users, I just wanted to touch on some really basic Gmail safety settings. And the reason for that is what you're seeing on the screen, the offs, that's the default configuration. And what we can do with these safety banners is we can set warning banners for a whole host of potentially troublesome emails. So for attachments, as you can see, we can warn users when an attachment is encrypted or it's got a script and it's come from an untrusted sender. Or we can warn them when an attachment type they've come through is anomalous, i.e. it's not the one they've actually really seen before and could be untrustworthy. We can make links and external images more secure by allowing a warning prompt for a user if they click into a link that goes to an untrusted domain. And there's a whole host of spoofing authentication banners we can enable, which tells a user when they've received an email that they might be a victim of domain name spoofing, employee name spoofing, unauthenticated emails, i.e. a DMARC fail, and spoofing via Google Groups as well. Some caution should be exercised when we're talking about unauthenticated email settings. If you yourselves haven't set up DMARC, all your messages will fail authentication and banners will appear for all your messages. So definitely, before you configure the spoofing authentication options, just have a look at your own DMARC configuration and make sure it is set up properly. We can, instead of just the banners, we can just reject or quarantine this message. It doesn't need to just be the banner. But if all these are disabled, if this is a config that you see in your environment, probably best to start off with the warning banner so we don't massively impact user experience and all this stuff. What I've tried to do here is I've tried to integrate a few scenarios into this session to keep it a good mix between product information and then these real world problems. And the first one I wanted to talk about was how to detect, react, and then prevent these phishing attacks. In terms of detection, I suppose you have to know that the phishing incident happens before you can react it, which is why we're starting with detection. So we can rely on system-defined email alerts in G Suite. So when users report a message as phishing, we can get an email alert, or we can get things in the alert center as well. We can also get alerts for phishing emails that arrive in the inbox due to bad whitelisting. So if there's an approved sender and it's sent a weird looking email, but your systems have just said, yeah, it looks fine, go for it, we can get an alert for that as well. We can also notify for phishing messages that detected post-delivery. So if it was reclassified after it's been sent to a user's inbox. And like I mentioned, we can get email alerts, or we can have it all centrally in the alert center, which is what this picture on the right-hand side is covering. In terms of next steps, enterprise customers can use the investigation tool to search for specific activity in the audit log. And that really is how we consider reacting to these phishing events. If we can take all the alerts that we get from the alert center, we can use the investigation tool to then search for specific emails and then delete or move them all to spam for all users in the environment. This works well if one message has come through, but it's been sent to 30 different people. We can take a single action to then get rid of it from everybody's inbox all at once. But this doesn't really seem to work on a larger scale. For bigger organizations, you can start to use activity rules, which can take automated actions based on that certain behavior that we specify in the investigation tool. So in this example here, we can create a rule that states if 5 or more people report a specific email as phishing within a certain time period, that email gets deleted from everyone's inbox in the environment. It might be a bit of a nuclear option. Perhaps that threshold should be changed for your business depending on your user count. But there's definitely more of a move towards automated management of your environment. And that's definitely something that Google believes in heavily. And I guess just to recap everything that we've talked about so far, how we prevent a successful phishing attack is we essentially act on the stuff that we've highlighted so far. So we enforce 2SV for all users in the domain, so the attacker doesn't get full access if they have a password. We lock down OAuth access to prevent these third parties abusing scope that they shouldn't even have access to in the first place. We should enroll our VIP users and admins in the Advanced Protection Program to lock down their account without making their working life more difficult. We should also enable the safety banners to prevent emails that come through to reduce the risk that users will knowingly click into links and then provide information on those messages. And I think from an admin perspective, a really important thing is to get users to report messages as phishing or spam. Like I said, this not only gives admins the alerts, but also feeds the Google AI backend that they can then make and take actions in the future as well. G Suite is a living and breathing product. So if it turns out that an entire organization marks a specific sender as trying to do phishing attacks, that'll influence other organizations in the mail for the other businesses feed. So everyone's supporting each other in this ecosystem. And definitely user actions in G Suite are really important to tell Google what is trustworthy and what isn't. So moving swiftly onto endpoint security and what we can do to protect the devices deployed in your organization. Again, we'll start off with the basics around mobile devices. So G Suite MDM has got a lot of uses. We see it best deployed as a catch-all for a bring your own device program. It comes in 2 main flavors, basic and advanced. It's no surprise basic allows for basic management of a mobile device, and we can do things like remotely wipe the account from the device, or we can force a user to set a lock screen on the device with basic management. Advanced management allows for everything else on this table on the right-hand side and a whole lot more. We would always suggest just gunning straight for advanced straight away, which will give you much more control over your employees' devices and give you much more visibility into your organization. Enterprise customers can make use of MDM rules to auto-approve or auto-reject devices based on specific details. There are parameters for things like device OS version, manufacturer model, and much more. There are also some pre-built rules, like wiping the phone or number of failed lock screen attempts. But I'd advise against using that on behalf of all your employees that have got kids that just want to play a game on their parents' phones. G Suite MDM could be its own hour-long webinar. For now, I'm almost purposely keeping it high level, but I definitely advise having a look further into MDM and considering its place in your existing mobile device strategy. And do bear in mind that all of the above, both basic and advanced, they're both included in your existing G Suite subscription at no additional cost. Google Chrome is defined by Google as a secure internet browser. It's got dozens of features built in to give you peace of mind in large-scale deployments. For example, the Chrome browser itself auto-updates every 6 weeks, so you don't have to manually push out updates across your entire fleet. And critical bug fixes tend to get pushed out within 24 hours, and again, don't require any input from you as administrator. And I personally, anecdotally, am aware that Chrome can sometimes get a bad rap when it comes to performance on lower end devices. But ultimately, the Chrome browser runs like its own operating system with its own task manager just for all of your Chrome tabs. With the Shift Escape shortcut, or if you're on a Chromebook like me, Search Escape, we can have a much more granular tab management approach, and it gives us much more visibility on which pages and which tabs are taking up all of your resources. So ultimately, Chrome is much more than a browser. It's an operating system that's just packaged as a browser. And it's got things built in like safe browsing, so we can warn users when they attempt to navigate dangerous sites or download potentially malicious files. It warns them when users are trying to navigate to malware-infected sites, the thing that I mentioned in my first slide. It will also warn when a user might be trying to download things that want to make system changes, which might be an unwanted software. And also provides predictive phishing protection. There's a lot of P's in that sentence, which helps counteract common social engineering attacks before they happen. And I also wanted to highlight in Chrome the password checkup tool that gives users an opportunity to check the security posture of all of their saved Chrome passwords. So if you navigate to passwords.google.com, a user can check of their own volition, they can check the passwords that have got stored in Chrome, and Chrome will tell them if it's been compromised in a known data breach, and as well as highlight any passwords that have been reused across multiple sites or any passwords that are weak. I know during my second slide, I said, if there's one thing you take from this webinar, but if I had to pick the top 2 things that you take from this webinar, first one would still be 2SV, but the second thing would be just to communicate this feature out to all of your users and give them the peace of mind that they can check on their passwords security posture without their admins having any visibility into any of this stuff. Running into scenarios again, I wanted to run through how to detect and secure a compromised device in this world of MDM. And I want to kind of talk about what is a compromised device. Before we talk about how we remedy it. A compromised device alert comes up in your admin console when a system change takes place. So it could be a change in a MAC address, it could be a change in the serial number, something that shouldn't really be intended on a mobile device. But it also covers things like jailbreaking an iOS device or rooting an Android device as well. The best course of action when a system change happens is simply to block the device so it doesn't have any further access to corporate data, and it also will lose access that it currently has to all the corporate data. But it's also important to recognize that we have seen some events where a user isn't familiar with the device or isn't familiar with the event that's happened with the phone. And I guess a word of caution here, we did see it when Android 10 was rolled out. It made a ton of system changes, and if you're an admin and you have MDM turned on, you will have seen loads of compromised device alerts. But for instances where a device is compromised and the user hasn't made these system changes, it's really important to take a couple of steps. First of all, it's really wise to wipe the account from the phone and to block the device. Wiping the account, like I said before, will get all the data off, but if we block it as well, it means it can't get more data onto the device. We should then look and reset the user sign-in cookies. And this isn't so much more about MDM, it's more about just good management of user credentials and user safety. If we reset the user sign-in cookies, it'll log them out of all devices and all browsers. And it'll mean that you, again, have data only where you want it to be. If we then navigate to the user's profile, we want to revoke the authorized apps. If you don't have app access control configured, what could have happened in that time period where a compromised device alert has come up and the user's found out? It could be that the attacker has given access to all these applications, and we want to undo any of those changes. And as you can see in this screenshot, we've got authorization dates, so we can map up the timeline with the compromised device and any authorizations that might have happened in that time period. And then finally, we obviously want to reset the password and clear the recovery information. The reason I'm specifically calling out recovery information is I'm also aware that sometimes attackers will take the action, they'll change recovery information, so once the account is then secured, they've got a means to get back in afterwards. And I think it's really important that not only do we make some changes to kind of reduce the impact of the incident, we also make sure that the account can't be recovered by the person that's taken all these actions as well. Another thing I wanted to talk about, which I haven't actually prepared for because Google announced it probably yesterday, there is a Windows 10 management feature that is being rolled out in the next couple of days. My plan was to have a slide on it. Up until about 2 days ago, it was a beta, so I didn't want to do a slide on a beta. But definitely there was a recent announcement around managing Windows 10 devices using the admin console. It's definitely something I'm happy to talk about towards the end if you have seen the announcements. But like I said, because it was recently rolled out, I don't have a slide on it, but I know plenty about it. So if you've got questions about how that works, more than happy to address that towards the end. Moving on, we've talked about end users, we've talked about devices, but obviously there's a whole host of things that we can do in G Suite, in the admin console, to also set up policies to make sure we're more secure and the data is better protected. Starting off, enterprise customers can make use of DLP, which prevents users from sharing sensitive content in Drive, in shared drives, and also via email as well. It's got its own dedicated section of the admin console now. Previously, it was separated between Gmail was in the advanced settings and Drive was in rules. It's now all under the data protection header. And the reason this has happened is because now we can have unified rules. We can have one rule for both Gmail and Drive. And if we make changes to them both at the same time. And as you can see on the screenshot, we've got two options for management. We can manage rules and we can manage detectors. Detectors tell G Suite what to look for. Rules just tell G Suite what to do when it finds that data. And again, it's always best to start off with detectors. So default detectors allow us to search for commonly requested sensitive data, things like credit card number, passport number, bank account numbers. There's a ton of regex built in the backend that we can use. No real additional configurations required for those. But if you do have your own custom requirements, you can create regex expressions, you can create custom word lists, email and domain lists, and also IP address lists to tell Google what is important to you. And then we can start taking actions based on what happens when that data has been found. This image is a very rudimentary attempt at creating a regex detector. It's very, very straightforward. The learn more link on that particular image takes you to a whole page that Google's produced around how to use regex. And definitely if you've got custom requirements around a specific account number that your organization uses that you want to protect, there's support on how you can configure that as well. So we told G Suite what's important to us and how to look for that data. And now we obviously need to think about what we would do if G Suite did find that data. So I just wanted to talk about the rule templates. There are quite a lot of really basic rule templates you can make use of that specifically are geared towards protecting financial information, health information, or PII as well. But I think the real meat and bones from this particular couple of slides is on this one. It's about understanding what rules can be configured within G Suite and what we can do with those rules. So for Gmail, we can alert, reject, modify, and quarantine. I have put an asterisk here because it's currently in testing, but it is designed to be rolled out in the next couple of weeks and months. For Drive, we can also do alert, block, or warn on external sharing. Again, the purpose here is to stop the sharing externally. Internally is not necessarily a problem because you're not losing your data, but external sharing is definitely a key area where Google wants to allow admins to prevent that external sharing of data. We can run things like content highlighting. So this yellow banner that you see on the screen, you can customize the wording completely, but we can warn a user that what they're trying to send isn't going to be possible to be sent. Before they hit the send button, they miss the email reject notice and they think, why have my email not been sent in the first place? We don't have to have this on. It's just an option that you can enable. But again, what we've seen is this does promote user behavior without them having to rely on guessing what made their email fail to be sent in the first place. And again, I talked about it earlier, but I'll just talk about it again. The Alert Center is designed to be a central hub for everything in your G Suite environment. And we can, in a DLP rule, set the severity of an alert. We can then assign that alert out to people on the team to say, hey, this message has been blocked. Can you as an individual go look at it? And we can assign this a priority, severity, and an assignee to that as well. If you don't use the Alert Center, you can also do email alerts. You can choose to send it to all the super admins, or you can choose individuals. And the individual that I've chosen here is actually a Google group. So I can send a notification to an entire group to say, hey, this message has been sent out, and it got caught in the filters. And again, if you manage your DLP in a third-party solution with a SOC team, you can add your SOC team's email address there instead. Context-aware access covers the specifics of a user's access request, and then it grants or rejects access based on certain parameters with that access request. So we can create access levels based on things like IP address, device policy, or geolocation of a user's request. We can then apply these access levels against the 13 core applications. And currently, it was announced this week, there is a beta for context-aware access to support SAML applications as well. Things like Workday, where you still want to make sure that data is protected, but G Suite is just expanding the areas that it covers. In the case of a device policy, we can create really comprehensive rules that would only grant access if things like a password set and the device is encrypted and it meets a certain Windows, Mac OS or Chrome OS version. We can also say it must be a Chrome device that's verified and enrolled, or we can state that it's a company-owned device or the device must be approved by an admin. Enabling all of these all at once might be a bit ambitious, but certainly it just allows us to get a bit more granularity in managing the devices that are accessing the corporate data in G Suite. A common use case that we see is to block access from countries that your organization simply doesn't operate in. I don't know many customers that we work with that have got offices in North Korea, so it's sensible to have context-aware access rules that say, this access request is from a country we don't operate in, like North Korea, let's just reject it to be safe. But also when we see companies that operate in countries that are very specific around how data can be handled, you can say that actually, this data can only be accessed by people in Germany, let's say, rather than just anyone that isn't this particular country. Google Drive security configuration. I wanted to have a brief chat about Drive file security, especially because most organizations just have file sharing set to on. And again, wanted to cover through some really important features that are available in G Suite to protect the data that you've got in Drive. So by default, when you turn on file sharing, publishing files on the web is just turned on. So users can publish things to the web, which then can be searched for by other people via Google if their parameters are specific enough. And whilst there are uses for marketing and PR teams to publish files, the majority of users don't require it. So it might be best to, depending on your organization, it would be best practices to disable this feature for everyone that isn't in a marketing or PR department or other areas as you see fit. And also set up an alert to inform admins when files are published, just to make sure that that's being tracked and being kept on top of. The access checker dictates what options are available when a user tries to share a file with someone who doesn't have access to that file via Gmail. We'd recommend this is set to recipients only, as very rarely we want a file to be shared with a recipient, and also, hey, the entire business, and also make it public online. Again, the default here is just making sure that it's set to recipients only, because we wouldn't ever really want a file to just be, by default, just shared with the entire world. Content distribution is a setting that governs whether users can move files to shared drives owned by other organizations. It's important to bear in mind that once a file is moved to an external shared drive, that file is no longer owned by your business, and that external party can just remove your access to the file. So setting this to no one is the most secure, but it does need to be weighed up against the level of impact it would have to your staff and how they can collaborate with third-party organizations. I think from an admin, security and good security is always about balancing protection with usability, and that's no surprise when we're on this call, I hope. And the content distribution piece is just making sure that you are protecting yourself as much as you reasonably can do against organizations that might just cut off your access without any prior warning. And finally, default link sharing. Users can have their files automatically shared with the business once the file is created. To be truthful, I've yet to see a single comprehensive use case for this or a single comprehensive reason to have this turned on. So I think for most organizations, it's just good to have this disabled and make sure it is disabled, unless you have a really good reason for a specific OU or for a specific group of users. But again, just make sure that this is set to off is the kind of the generic best practice that we would advise. Shared drives are arguably the best way to organize files in Google Drive. The way that we see customers that have been on G Suite for 5-6 years is they'll find that probably all their major documentation is owned by the IT manager or owned by the CEO, because that's just how the My Drive folder structure has changed over time. And by default, while shared drives are brilliant, users can create their own shared drives. And what we suggest is you restrict the option for users to create their own shared drives, because what we tend to see, as you can see in the screenshot, is you end up getting a bunch of tests. You might get 10 different finance and 39 different HR shared drives. And what we want to do is make sure that everyone's storing everything in the same place. So if we only allow admins to create the shared drives, the admins can then dictate where files are being shared. And it also means that when you go to manage your shared drives, you don't get things like in this image, where you just have loads of test things and you've no idea who's using them and if they're actually still being actively used or if they're just enabled and active by that means instead. The other thing to think about with shared drives is making sure that users aren't members of shared drives if they don't need access to it. And what we can do instead is we can make a Google group a member of a shared drive instead of user permissions. And that's the best way of handling the joiner, mover, leaver process. What you might find is somebody has joined the business in support, they've then gone and worked in finance, then IT, maybe marketing, weird career path, but hey, whatever works. And what we want to do is make sure that person doesn't still have access to the finance, HR, marketing, and IT shared drives. The best way to do this is make sure that your group's management is on point. Make sure that when somebody moves or leaves the team, they're removed from the group, and then the group will then cascade the correct shared drive permissions, and they won't have access to tons of different things that they shouldn't need access to. And one other final thing to note is that folder sharing permissions are coming soon. It is something that I've seen commonly requested across quite a lot of organizations. They want to use shared drives, but they can't share folders on the shared drives. Again, that is definitely coming soon. And the final scenario I wanted to talk about is seeing what data is shared externally. There's a file exposure report in the admin console under security dashboards that shows over a period of time what days files are being shared with certain individuals, which domains are being shared with, and whether it's just internal sharing or external, anyone with a link, and even public things as well, anyone in the domain as well. The same report also looks into the most popular files, which files are being viewed the most, and then which domains are being commonly shared with the most. And what you can do is you can look to see which files, and you can export the list of files that have been shared with domains that perhaps you don't work with. So we can look to see whether Gmail is a domain that files are being shared with often, and we can launch an investigation via the investigation tool to narrow that down into a list of documents, who they're owned by, and who the action was taken by as well. I kind of wanted to finish off this section by talking about a very, very, very brief checklist of things to work towards for both Drive and Gmail. Now, security in G Suite, as Alex mentioned in the off, security is such a wide-ranging subject. But I wanted to make sure that these kind of really key things for Drive and Gmail, which are the most common data stores in G Suite, I wanted to highlight these because I've not had a chance to highlight them as we've gone through so far. So with Drive, there are some really key and I would argue some basic things to be mindful of, to make sure that when users share a file externally, that they're warned, to ensure that for external collaborators, they have to sign into Google, which will allow you to better track who's viewed or edited a document. The third option here is to consider, maybe not outright, but to consider disabling offline access to ensure that data doesn't stay cached on a device. And the follow-on from that is also considering disabling backup and sync. Backup and sync allows the user to store a massive amount of files locally for the intention of syncing it back to Drive, but that feature has now been superseded by Drive File Stream. So review your backup and sync usage and turn it off if you don't need it anymore. And then don't allow Drive add-ons, which may form part of your overarching Chrome browser extension management strategy, and definitely ties into the stuff we've talked about with app access control as well. And then moving on to Gmail, it's really important to ensure that your email authentication methods, so SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, are effectively configured to safeguard your organization's online reputation. It's also very much recommended to disable AMAP and POP, ultimately to prevent people from using these third-party mail clients that we can't control, but also to prevent people from circumventing MDM by AMAPing their mail straight to their device through third-party mail clients like Outlook and Thunderbird, etc. The third item here is to enable enhanced message scanning in the Gmail advanced settings to make sure that messages, it does slow down message transfer a little bit, but it just doubly makes sure that files are virus scanned for the 14th, 15th time in the process with Gmail, and just make sure the messages that are coming through are being scanned kind of doubly so. And two final watch points for Gmail. What we see very regularly when we host security workshops with customers is we see full domains set as an approved sender. And it's really important to be mindful that partial matches for that domain will also apply. So if you were to whitelist hello.com, you would also be whitelisting hello.com, etc. And whilst that perhaps is a bit of a weird use case, it's best practice not to whitelist an entire domain because you can't always verify everything that domain ever sends is suitable for your organization. And the final one here, again, this might be an obvious one that I'll finish with, is don't whitelist IP addresses. Ownership of IPs will change over time, and as an organization, you don't really have much control over when an IP changes hands and who it goes to, unless they're IPs that you outright own. And I guess it's just good best practice, really, to make sure that you don't whitelist IP addresses. It does make the review process a bit more of a nightmare when you come around to it.